Mother-in-law was kicked out of the house and had to sleep in the backyard. The reason is stunning. Margaret Miller never imagined that at 67 years old she would be sleeping in a camping tent in the backyard of the very house where she had lived for 3 years. The early morning was cold and damp, and through the illuminated windows of the dining room she could see her daughter Susan, her son-in-law Richard, and her 2 grandchildren eating dinner peacefully, as if she had never existed. The night before, Richard had shouted at her in a way she would never forget. He said he was tired of finding her going through his personal belongings during the early morning hours, and that he would no longer tolerate that invasion of privacy. Susan, her own daughter, sided with her husband and declared that her mother needed some time away from the house to reflect on her behavior. What hurt the most was that they wouldn't even listen to her explanations. Margaret pulled the thin blanket closer to her face and felt tears running down her wrinkled cheeks. How could she explain to them that she wasn't being curious or nosy out of bad character? How could she make them understand that every drawer she opened, every paper she examined, was driven by a genuine concern that grew every day? 2 weeks ago, a phone call had changed everything. It was a female voice, unknown, speaking low and nervous. The woman didn't identify herself, but she knew intimate details about Richard's life that left Margaret completely alarmed. She said she needed to alert the family about very serious things that were happening, but she couldn't provide more details over the phone. She only asked Margaret to keep an eye on her son-in-law's strange movements. Initially, Margaret tried to ignore that phone call. Richard had always been a good husband to Susan, hard-working and devoted to the children. But as the days went by, she began to notice small changes in his behavior that made her uneasy. He came home later from work, received calls that left him visibly nervous, and had started keeping documents in different places around the house. A neighbor tapped lightly on the tent. It was Mrs. Gladys, a kind 72-year-old lady who had lived next door for over 20 years. "Margaret, dear, I brought you a warmer blanket and a thermos of coffee. What's going on?" she asked worriedly, handing the items through the tent opening. "Oh, Gladys, it's a long story." "Thank you for your kindness," Margaret replied, gratefully accepting the blanket and the hot coffee. "Listen, I don't want to stick my nose where I shouldn't, but I've been seeing strange things here at your house over the past few weeks. Different cars stopping out front, people I've never seen before talking to your son-in-law." Gladys spoke softly, looking toward the house window. "Sometimes I worry it might be something serious." Margaret felt her heart race. So it wasn't just her imagination. Other people had noticed the changes too. "What kind of cars? What people?" Margaret asked anxiously. "Dark cars, always very clean. And the people, well-dressed, you know. Suit and tie, briefcase in hand. They stand around talking outside before going in. Once I saw your son-in-law very nervous after they left." That information confirmed the suspicions Margaret had been harboring. She wasn't imagining things. Richard really was involved in something he preferred to keep secret, and that worried her deeply. "Gladys, can I tell you something?" "But it has to stay just between us," Margaret whispered. The neighbor nodded and moved closer to the tent. 2 weeks ago, I received an anonymous call. A woman warning me about serious problems involving Richard. She wouldn't give details, but she told me to keep an eye out. Ever since, I've been trying to figure out what's going on. "And that's why you were—" Gladys hesitated. "That's why I was going through his things, yes. I know it seems wrong, but I'm desperate. Susan is my only daughter, and the boys are my life. If there's something dangerous going on, I need to protect them." Gladys nodded with understanding. "You're being a mother, Margaret. Any mother would do the same. But tell me, did you find out anything?" Margaret took a deep breath before answering. "I found strange documents hidden in his office, contracts with names I don't recognize, very high figures, and some letters that seemed threatening." "Threatening how?" "One of them mentioned serious consequences if certain conditions weren't met. Another talked about deadlines that can't be missed, and people who mustn't know." "Gladys, I'm terrified that my daughter and grandchildren are in danger." The neighbor stayed silent for a few moments, absorbing the information. "Margaret, have you tried talking directly to Susan about your concerns?" "I have, yes, but she's completely blinded by love for Richard. Every time I bring up a suspicion, she accuses me of jealousy, of not accepting that he's a busy, successful man. She says I'm inventing problems where none exist. And Richard, have you tried talking to him? He avoids me. When I try to steer the conversation toward work or anything more serious, he changes the subject or makes up an excuse to get away. Gladys let out a deep sigh. Look, dear, I don't know if I can help much, but I want you to know you can count on me. If you need anything, just call, and I'll keep an eye out too. If I see more of those strange people, I'll let you know. Thank you, Gladys. I don't know what I'd do without a friend like you. After the neighbor left, Margaret was alone with her thoughts. The hot coffee warmed her inside, but the emotional chill kept freezing her heart. Through the window she could see Richard helping the kids with their homework, while Susan tidied up the kitchen. The scene was so perfect, so normal, that for a moment she almost doubted her own suspicions. But then she remembered the anonymous call, the strange documents, the mysterious people Gladys had confirmed. Something was going on, and she couldn't simply ignore it. Around 10 o'clock at night, Margaret saw Richard slip out through the back door. He was carrying a folder she had never seen before and looked around nervously. He walked to the gate and met a man in a dark suit who was waiting on the sidewalk. Margaret quietly stepped out of the tent and hid behind a tree in the backyard, trying to overhear the conversation. The voices were low, but she managed to catch a few words that alarmed her even more. "The documents are all here," Richard said, handing over the folder. "You need to be very discreet. If anyone in the family finds out before the right time, it could compromise everything," the man replied. "I understand. But it's getting hard to keep it a secret. My mother-in-law is suspicious. Has she found out anything? I keep catching her going through my papers. Just yesterday I caught her in my office during the middle of the night. That's dangerous. You need to handle this situation before it becomes a bigger problem." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. They were talking about her as if she were a threat that needed to be eliminated. What exactly was Richard hiding that was so important? The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but the voices got even lower, and she couldn't make out anything else. The man handed Richard some papers and left in the dark car. Richard stood at the gate for a few minutes, seeming lost in thought. Margaret took the opportunity to quietly slip back into the tent before he could see her. When Richard came inside, Margaret heard raised voices coming from the living room. Susan was questioning where he had gone so late. "I just went to take care of something for work, honey. Nothing important," he replied. "Richard, you've been acting strange for weeks. Coming home late, leaving the house at odd hours, getting phone calls that make you nervous. What's going on?" "Susan, please trust me. It's just a rough patch at work, but it'll pass soon." "So my mother was right then? Something wrong is going on?" "Your mother is a paranoid woman who can't accept that her husband has professional responsibilities. Don't listen to her conspiracy theories." Margaret felt a knife twist in her heart hearing those words. Richard was deliberately dismissing her concerns and manipulating Susan against her. "But Richard, she's my mother. If she's worried, there must be a reason. The reason is that she can't accept sharing you with me and the kids. She's trying to create problems where none exist so she can have your undivided attention. That's not true. My mother has always respected our marriage. Then why does she keep going through my things? Why does she keep asking questions about my work? Why does she keep investigating my life as if I were a criminal?" The argument went on for a few more minutes, but Margaret had already heard enough. Richard was consciously pushing Susan away from her, planting doubts about his intentions and character. The next morning, Susan appeared in the backyard carrying a tray with breakfast. Her expression was serious and distant. "Mom, I brought coffee and bread. We need to talk." Margaret got out of the tent with difficulty. The night in the tent had left her body sore, especially her back and knees. "Thank you, sweetheart. I missed you at dinner yesterday." "Mom, I'm not going to pretend everything is normal. You need to explain to me what's going on. Why were you going through Richard's things?" Margaret looked into her daughter's eyes and saw coldness, where there used to be only love and closeness. "Susan, I'm your mother. Everything I do is for your well-being and the well-being of your children. That's not an answer, Mom. I want to know specifically why you were rummaging through my husband's drawers in the middle of the night. Margaret took a deep breath. She knew that moment would be crucial for the future of their relationship. I received a phone call, Susan, a woman warning me about serious problems involving Richard. Ever since then, I've noticed strange behavior in him. What woman? What call? I don't know who she was. She didn't identify herself, but she knew details about you all that left me worried. Mom, that's pure paranoia. Anyone can call spreading gossip or trying to cause trouble. You can't believe an anonymous call. But it's not just the call, sweetheart. Richard has changed. Richard. He comes home late, receives strange calls, hides documents. He has an important job, Mom. It's normal for him to be needed at odd hours and to have confidential documents. Susan, last night I saw him meeting with an unknown man right here in front of the house. They talked about keeping family secrets and about me being a problem. Susan looked at Margaret with a mixture of disappointment and anger. You were spying on my husband? Mum, that's unacceptable. I was protecting you and the children. Protecting them from what? From the man who works 12 hours a day to support our family? From the devoted father who plays with the kids every weekend? From the person who took you into our home when you had nowhere to go? Every word from Susan was like a slap in Margaret's face. Her own daughter was turning completely against her. Sweetheart, I know it's hard to accept, but something is wrong. A mother doesn't lie to her daughter. A mother doesn't spy on her son-in-law either. A mother doesn't invade other people's privacy. A mother doesn't try to create problems in a happy marriage. Susan, please, listen to me. No, Mom, that's enough. Richard was right. You can't accept that I have a life of my own, a husband who makes me happy. You're trying to destroy my family out of pure selfishness. Margaret felt her world collapse around her. Her daughter was completely misreading her intentions. Susan, you're everything I have in life. I would never do anything to hurt you. Then stop this unfounded persecution of Richard. Accept that he's a good man who takes good care of me and the children. What if I'm right? What if there really is something dangerous going on? Then you're going to have to prove it, Mom, because right now all I see is a bitter woman trying to destroy her own daughter's happiness. Susan picked up the tray and stood up to leave. You can stay in the tent as long as you need to reflect on your behavior. When you're ready to apologize to Richard and stop these unfounded accusations, you'll be welcome back. Margaret was left alone in the backyard, feeling more lonely than she had ever felt in her life. Her daughter had chosen to believe her husband instead of trusting the mother who had raised her with so much love and dedication. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us out since we're just getting started. Now continuing, for the rest of the morning, Margaret watched the family routine through the windows. Richard left for work without looking toward the backyard. The children went to school without even saying goodbye to their grandmother. Susan did the household chores with abrupt movements, clearly still upset about the situation. Around noon, Gladys showed up in the backyard again. How did you sleep last night, dear? Badly, Gladys, very badly. Susan is completely against me. She thinks I'm making up problems out of jealousy or bitterness. And you? Do you still think something's wrong? More than ever. Last night I overheard a conversation between Richard and a stranger that confirmed my suspicions. They're plotting something and they see me as a threat. Gladys sat down on the grass next to the tent. Margaret, I need to tell you something. This morning, after Richard left for work, a man came by. He stopped at my house asking about you. What man? Tall, well-dressed, said he was a lawyer. He wanted to know about your family dynamics, how long you've lived here, whether you've noticed anything unusual. Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. What did you say? I said it was none of my business and that he should talk to the family directly, but I got the impression he already knew a lot about you. What do you mean? He mentioned he knew you were living in the backyard, that there had been a family argument, and that he was monitoring the situation to make sure there weren't any bigger problems. Margaret ran her hand through her hair, feeling more and more lost. Gladys, I'm scared. If there are people investigating our family, it's because Richard is involved in something very serious. Maybe you should seek professional help, a lawyer or... No, I can't do that without being sure. If I'm wrong, I'll destroy my relationship with Susan for good. I need more evidence. So what do you intend to do? Keep investigating, but more discreetly. That afternoon, Margaret decided to try a different approach. Instead of looking for physical evidence in the house, she decided to follow Richard from a distance to better understand his activities. When he got home from work, around 6 in the evening, Margaret saw him talking nervously on his cell phone in the yard. She managed to get close enough to hear fragments of the conversation. Yes, I understand the deadline is tight. No, she hasn't found out anything specific yet, but she's suspicious. Of course, I'll keep it confidential until the end. Richard ended the call and went inside. Margaret returned to the tent with more questions than answers. Who was the person on the other end of the line? What was that deadline? What was it she couldn't find out? During dinner, which Margaret could observe through the window, the family seemed tense. Richard was clearly worried about something. Susan was asking questions he avoided answering, and the children could sense the heavy mood between their parents. After dinner, Richard left again. This time, Margaret decided to follow him, keeping a safe distance. He drove to a commercial district and entered an office building. Margaret waited on the street for almost 2 hours, until she saw him come out accompanied by 2 people, a man and a woman, both very well dressed. The 3 of them talked on the sidewalk for a few minutes. Margaret couldn't hear what they were saying, but Richard's body language showed anxiety. He gestured a lot and shook his head negatively several times. When Richard got home, it was almost midnight. Margaret arrived before him and hid in the tent. She heard him coming through the front door and talking quietly with Susan. "How was the meeting?" Susan asked. "Complicated. There are some obstacles we didn't expect." "What kind of obstacles?" "Legal issues, mostly, and some people who need to be convinced." "Richard, you're scaring me." "Convinced of what?" "Susan, please trust me. In a few days, everything will be resolved, and you'll understand why I had to keep it a secret." "But why all the mystery? We've been married for 10 years. We've never hidden anything from each other." "Because this time is different. It's bigger than anything we've ever faced before." Margaret slept poorly that night, troubled by the conversations she had overheard. The next morning, she woke up to the sound of raised voices coming from the house. It was Richard arguing with someone on the phone. "No, I won't accept that kind of pressure. You can't change the rules in the middle of the game. If that's how it is, maybe I should reconsider the whole situation." The call ended abruptly, and Margaret heard Richard talking to Susan. "Who was that?" Susan asked. "Trouble at work. Nothing that can't be fixed." "Richard, stop treating me like a child. I know when you're lying. What's going on?" "Susan, you'll know everything soon. I'm just asking for a few more weeks of patience." "A few weeks? Richard, this can't go on like this. The kids are noticing something is wrong. My mother is sleeping in the backyard because she thinks you're hiding something dangerous." "Your mother is sleeping in the backyard because she doesn't respect our privacy and keeps inventing conspiracies where none exist. And what if she's right? What if there really is something wrong?" Margaret held her breath, waiting for Richard's answer. "Susan, do you trust me?" "Of course I trust you." "Then stop questioning and wait a little longer. Soon everything will make sense." Around 10 in the morning, an unexpected event completely changed the course of the situation. A City Hall car pulled up in front of the house, and 2 men in uniform got out. They rang the doorbell and talked to Susan at the door. Margaret managed to hear part of the conversation. "Mum, we received a complaint that there's a person living illegally in the backyard of this residence that may constitute a violation of municipal zoning regulations." Susan looked visibly embarrassed. "It's my mother. She's going through a temporary family situation." "We understand, ma'am, but a residential backyard cannot be used as a dwelling, even temporarily. You'll need to regularize the situation within 48 hours, or we'll have to issue a fine." After the men left, Susan stood at the door for a few minutes, clearly shaken by the situation. Margaret came out of the tent and approached her daughter. "Susan, I don't want to cause trouble with City Hall. If you prefer, I can find somewhere else to stay." "Mum," Susan let out a deep sigh. "Come inside. Let's sort this out." Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she could finally talk to her daughter without Richard's influence. Inside the house, Susan prepared tea for both of them, and they sat down in the kitchen. "Mom, I need you to be honest with me. What exactly did you find out about Richard that made you so worried?" Margaret decided to tell everything from the beginning. The anonymous call, the strange documents, the mysterious people, the conversations she had overheard. Susan listened to it all in silence, with an increasingly worried expression. "Mom, some of the things you're describing, I've noticed them too." "Really? Richard really has changed a lot in the past few weeks. He's anxious, nervous, avoids talking about work, and he's been getting calls at odd hours that leave him very agitated." "So you also think something is wrong?" "I don't know, Mom. I'm confused. On one hand, I've known Richard for 10 years, and he's always been an honest man. On the other hand, his current behavior is very different from normal. Susan, no matter what it is, we need to find out the truth. If Richard is in trouble, we can help him. If he's hiding something dangerous, we need to protect you and the children." "You're right, Mom. But how are we going to find out?" "Tonight, when he leaves again, we can follow him together. If we work as a team, maybe we can understand what's going on." Susan hesitated for a few moments. "All right, but if we find out you were wrong and Richard is just under pressure at work, you'll need to apologize to him." "Agreed. And if we find out I was right, then we'll face whatever comes together." That afternoon, Margaret went back inside the house for the first time in 3 days. It was strange to be in her room again, to take a shower in the familiar bathroom, to sit at the table for lunch. The children were happy to see her back, but they sensed there was tension in the air. Richard came home from work around 7 in the evening and seemed surprised to find Margaret inside the house. "Susan, I thought we had talked about this. Richard, City Hall came by today. My mother can't keep sleeping in the backyard because it's against city ordinances. Besides, enough time has passed. I want the two of you to talk and settle your differences." Richard looked back and forth at Margaret and Susan, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "All right, Margaret, I'm sorry things got to this point. Maybe I overreacted." Margaret was surprised by Richard's conciliatory tone. It was very different from the anger he had shown a few days earlier. "Richard, I also want to apologize if I invaded your privacy, but you need to understand that I was worried about the family." "I understand, Margaret, and maybe it's time for me to explain why I've been so strange lately." Susan and Margaret exchanged glances. Finally, Richard would reveal what was going on. "A few weeks ago, I received a very important professional offer, an opportunity that could completely change our financial situation, but it's something delicate requiring total secrecy until all the details are finalized." "What kind of offer?" asked Susan. "An international company wants to hire me to coordinate a very large project here in the United States. The salary is 3 times what I currently make, with excellent benefits. But until the contract is signed, I can't reveal details to anyone. Not even to you, Susan." Margaret and Susan looked at each other. The explanation seemed plausible, but Margaret still had doubts. "Richard, if it's just a job offer, why all the mystery? Why the secret meetings, the hidden documents?" "Because my current company doesn't know I'm negotiating with another one. If they find out before I make my final decision, I could lose my current job and end up with neither." "And the people who come to the house," insisted Margaret. "They're representatives of the interested company. Sometimes we need to discuss contract details in a private setting." Susan seemed convinced by the explanation, but Margaret still felt there was something more. "Richard, can I see the contract documents?" "Margaret, I can't show confidential documents. It could jeopardize the entire negotiation." "At least tell me the company name." "I can't reveal that yet either, but I promise that as soon as everything is settled, I'll tell you all the details." That night, during dinner, the family atmosphere was more relaxed than in recent days. Richard made a point of being especially attentive to Margaret, as if trying to make up for the days of tension. But Margaret still had an odd feeling. Richard's explanation was logical, but something in his body language and tone of voice suggested he wasn't telling the whole truth. After dinner, Richard said he needed to leave for one last meeting related to the job offer. "It's the final meeting. If all goes well, I can tell you everything tomorrow." After he left, Margaret spoke privately with Susan. "Sweetheart, I still think we should follow him. His explanation may be true, but there are details that don't add up." "What details, Mom?" "If it were just a job offer, Why did I get that anonymous call? Why would someone warn me about serious problems? Maybe it was some envious colleague trying to stir up trouble. And the conversation I overheard yesterday about seeing me as a threat. If it were just about a job, why would I be a threat? Susan reflected for a few moments. You're right, Mum, some things really don't fit. Let's follow him, but from a distance. If it really is just work, we'll apologize later. The two of them quietly left the house and followed Richard's car, keeping a safe distance. He didn't go to the office building like the other times. This time he drove to the North Shore and stopped in front of a large, well-kept house. Margaret and Susan parked on the parallel street and walked until they could observe the house without being seen. There were several cars parked out front, and through the lit windows they could see several people gathered in the living room. Looks like a party or a social gathering, Susan commented. Or a business meeting in an informal setting, Margaret replied. They watched for about an hour. Through the windows they could see Richard chatting animatedly with other people, drinking wine, laughing. It didn't look like a tense work meeting. Around 10 o'clock at night, people began saying their goodbyes. Margaret and Susan watched Richard warmly hug several people, as if they were close friends. Susan, those people don't look like co-workers doing business. They look like close friends celebrating something. I thought it was strange too, Mom, but maybe they're colleagues who became friends, or... The conversation was interrupted when they saw Richard leave the house, carrying several bags and a large box. He put everything in the trunk of his car and went back to say goodbye to the people at the door. What do you suppose he's taking? Margaret whispered. I don't know, but let's follow him to see where he goes. Richard drove back downtown, but he didn't go home. He stopped at a 24-hour commercial building and went inside carrying the bags and the box. Margaret and Susan waited in the car for almost an hour until they saw him come out. This time, he wasn't carrying anything. Mom, this is getting stranger and stranger. Why would he take things from a residential house to a commercial building at night? I don't know, sweetheart, but I'm sure it's not about a normal job. When Richard got home, Margaret and Susan were already there, pretending they had spent the night watching television. How was the meeting? Susan asked casually. Very good. I believe tomorrow I'll have good news to share. Where was it? At the company director's house, a more informal setting to finalize the details. Margaret watched Richard carefully. He seemed relaxed and satisfied, but there was something forced about his smile. Richard, did you drink wine? Margaret asked. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. A toast to closing the deal. Why? Just curious. You seem more relaxed today. It's because everything is finally coming together. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. The images of the meeting at the house, the bags Richard carried, the office building, kept replaying in her mind. The next morning, she decided to take a bolder approach. She waited for Richard to leave for work and Susan to take the kids to school, and then she went to the building where she had seen him the night before. It was a business center with several small companies. Margaret talked to the doorman, making up a story that she was looking for a friend who worked there. What does your friend look like? Asked the doorman. Margaret described Richard. Oh, that gentleman. He came last night to drop off some things at Mr. Sterling's office. Mr. Sterling? A lawyer. He has an office on the 5th floor, specialist in inheritances and estates. Margaret felt her heart race. A lawyer specializing in inheritances. Why would Richard be involved with that? Does he come here often? Margaret asked. No, that was the first time I saw him, but he seemed to know Mr. Sterling well. Margaret left the building with more questions than answers. She decided to do a search on the internet about Mr. Sterling to better understand who he was. At home, using the family computer, she discovered that Arthur Sterling was indeed a respected lawyer, specialized in probate law. His office had an excellent reputation and handled complex inheritance cases. Why would Richard be consulting an inheritance specialist? Had someone in his family recently passed away? He never mentioned anything about that. Margaret decided to investigate further. She called some of Richard's distant relatives she knew, pretending she wanted to send sympathy cards. To her surprise, she discovered that an uncle of Richard's, with whom he didn't have much contact, had passed away 2 months ago. He was a wealthy man, owner of several companies who never married and had no children. The pieces were beginning to fall into place in Margaret's mind. Richard could have inherited something substantial from this uncle, which would explain the mysterious meetings, the confidential documents, and the need to keep it a secret. But there were still points that didn't make sense. If it were a legitimate inheritance, why all the mystery? Why not tell the family? And above all, why would someone make an anonymous call warning about serious problems? When Susan came home from school with the kids, Margaret shared her findings. "Mum, this would explain a lot. If Richard inherited money, he might be planning a surprise for us." "Maybe, dear, but I'm still worried about the secretive way he's handling all of this. Maybe it's because he wants to make sure the inheritance will be released before raising expectations for the family. Or maybe there's some legal problem with that inheritance that he's trying to resolve before telling us." That afternoon, Margaret decided to try a different approach. Instead of continuing to investigate secretly, she decided to talk directly to Richard about her findings. When he got home from work, she called him for a private conversation in the backyard. "Richard, I found out about your uncle's inheritance." Richard visibly turned pale. "How? What did you find out?" "I know he passed away 2 months ago and that you've been dealing with lawyers specializing in inheritances. Is that what you've been hiding from us?" Richard was silent for a few moments, clearly thinking about how to respond. "Margaret, it's more complicated than you imagine." "Then explain it to me. If it's about inheritance, why all the secrecy? Why not tell Susan?" "Because I'm not sure yet if I'm going to be able to receive the inheritance. There are legal complications." "What kind of complications?" "Other relatives are contesting the will. They say my uncle wasn't of sound mind when he wrote it. If they win the court battle, I won't get anything." "And that's why you're keeping it a secret?" "I don't want to create false expectations in the family. If it doesn't work out in the end, it would be a huge disappointment for everyone." Richard's explanation sounded logical, but Margaret still felt there was something more. "Richard, I received an anonymous call warning me about serious problems involving you. If it were just an inheritance dispute, why would someone do that?" Richard hesitated again before answering. "Maybe it was one of the other heirs trying to cause problems in my family. They know that if I'm emotionally shaken, I might give up the dispute." "That would make sense," Margaret admitted. "Margaret, I promise that as soon as the legal matter is resolved, I'll tell you everything. But for now, I ask that you trust me and stop the investigations." That night, Margaret talked to Susan about her conversation with Richard. "Sweetheart, his explanation is coherent, but I still feel there are details he's not telling us. Mom, maybe we should give him the benefit of the doubt. If he's really fighting for an inheritance that could benefit our family, he deserves our support." "You're right, but I'm just asking for a few more days of attention. If it's truly just the inheritance, everything will become clear soon. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot since we're just starting out. Now continuing. In the following days, Richard seemed more relaxed and communicative. He started playing with the kids again, helping Susan with the household chores, and treating Margaret with genuine warmth. But Margaret kept watching discreetly. She noticed he still received calls that made him tense, and occasionally left the house at unusual hours. One morning, while Richard was in the shower, his cell phone rang on the kitchen table. Margaret looked at the screen and saw a name she didn't recognize, Mr. Harrison. On impulse, she answered the call. "Hello?" "Richard?" asked a male voice. "No, this is Margaret, Richard's mother-in-law. He's in the shower. Can I help?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Margaret, this is Mr. Harrison, Richard's lawyer. Can I ask him to call me back when he gets a chance?" "Of course. But may I ask what it's about?" "It's about the inheritance case. There are some documents that need to be signed urgently. Sir, forgive my curiosity, but how long has Richard been dealing with this inheritance?" "About 3 months, ma'am. It's a very complex case, with several heirs involved." "I see. And is everything going well?" "Well, there are some obstacles, but we're optimistic about the final outcome." When Richard came out of the shower, Margaret passed along the message about the lawyer's call. Who answered? Richard asked, visibly concerned. I did. He said he needs to talk to you about urgent documents. Margaret, please don't answer my phone calls anymore. It could cause misunderstandings. Sorry, Richard. I was just trying to help. Richard called the lawyer back and talked in the backyard away from Margaret. She could only catch a few words. Deadline, court ruling, original documents. That afternoon, Richard received an unexpected visitor. It was an elegant woman, around 50 years old, who spoke with him privately in the living room. Margaret, pretending to tidy up the house, managed to overhear fragments of the conversation. Richard, you need to decide soon. The other heirs are pressuring for an out-of-court settlement, the woman said. But if I accept the settlement, I'll receive far less than what I'm entitled to. That's true, but if the dispute continues through the courts, it could take years, and there's no guarantee of victory. And my family, they don't know anything yet. That's your decision, but the longer time passes, the harder it will be to keep it a secret. The woman left after 2 hours of conversation. Richard remained visibly shaken for the rest of the day. During dinner, Susan noticed his emotional state. Richard, are you okay? You seem worried. Just work stuff, honey. Nothing important. Margaret and Susan exchanged glances. It was clear Richard was lying. That night, Richard barely got any sleep. Margaret heard him getting up several times, walking around the house, talking quietly on the phone. The next morning, he announced he needed to travel for 2 days to handle work-related matters. What city? Susan asked. Chicago. Meetings with important clients. Can I come along? It's been a while since we traveled alone together. Not this time, Susan. The meetings will last all day. You'd be bored. After Richard left on his trip, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She decided to call Mr. Harrison's office directly to try to better understand the situation. Mr. Harrison, this is Margaret, Richard Thompson's mother-in-law. We spoke on the phone yesterday. Yes, Mrs. Margaret. How can I help you? Sir, I'm worried about my son-in-law. He's been very stressed about this inheritance matter. Could you give me an idea of how things are going? Well, Ma'am, I can't go into details due to client confidentiality, but I can tell you it's a complex process. Do you think he has a real chance of winning? The chances exist, yes, but there are risks too. The will is being contested by other family members claiming the deceased wasn't mentally capable when he wrote it. And if he loses? If he loses, he won't receive anything from the inheritance, and he'll still have to pay the court costs, which aren't cheap. Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. Court costs? How much would that be? In a dispute of this magnitude, it could reach hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mr. Harrison, may I ask what the value of the inheritance in dispute is? The lawyer hesitated. Mrs. Margaret, that's confidential, but since the family will be directly affected, we're talking about approximately $5 million. Margaret almost dropped the phone. $5 million. Now she understood why Richard was so nervous and secretive. Mr. Harrison, is there a chance he could lose everything and still end up owing money? Unfortunately, yes. That's why I'm advising him to consider the out-of-court settlement. It would be less money, but without risks. How much would the settlement be? $1.5 million net, but he needs to decide quickly. After ending the call, Margaret was stunned by the information. Richard was risking everything on a $5 million gamble, but he could lose and still end up in debt. When Susan came home from work, Margaret shared everything she had discovered. Mom, $5 million? I can't believe Richard hid something so important from us. Honey, now I understand why he was so secretive. It's an amount that would change our lives forever. But I also understand why he's so nervous. If he loses, he could lead us to financial ruin. Susan, I think we should support him, but also help him make the most sensible decision. What do you mean? Maybe we should convince him to accept the settlement. $1.5 million is still a lot of money, and we wouldn't risk losing everything. You're right, Mom, but first we need him to be honest with us about the whole situation. When Richard returned from his trip, late in the afternoon of the second day, Margaret and Susan were waiting for him in the living room for a serious conversation. Richard, come sit here. We need to talk, said Susan in a grave tone. Richard noticed that something had changed and sat down, visibly nervous. What happened? We know about the $5 million inheritance, Margaret said directly. Richard went completely pale. How? Who told you? I spoke with your lawyer. Richard, why did you hide something so important from us? Richard covered his face with his hands and sighed deeply. Because I didn't want to involve you in such a risky situation. But we're a family. Problems and opportunities should be shared, said Susan. Susan, if I lose this dispute, I could end up owing hundreds of thousands of dollars. That could destroy our financial life. I preferred to take the risk alone. And if you win? If I win, our lives will change completely. $5 million would give us security for the rest of our lives. Margaret approached Richard and held his hands. Richard, now that we know everything, we want to help you make the best decision. What decision? Your lawyer said there's a proposal for an out-of-court settlement, $1.5 million with no risks. But that's much less than what I'm entitled to. It's much less, but it's still an amount that would change our lives for the better, without the risk of losing everything, argued Susan. Richard was thoughtful for a few minutes. You think I should accept the settlement? Son, in my eyes, you're already a winner just for having this opportunity. $1.5 million is more money than most people see in their entire lives, said Margaret. Susan, what do you think? I think I'd rather have the certainty of a secure future than bet everything on a bigger possibility. If we lose, the children will be the ones most affected. Richard nodded slowly. Maybe you're both right. The risk really is very high. So are you going to accept the settlement? Asked Margaret. I'll talk to the lawyer tomorrow and see if it's still possible. That night, for the first time in weeks, Richard slept peacefully. The decision to share the secret with his family seemed to have lifted a huge weight off his shoulders. The next day, he had a long conversation with Mr. Harrison and confirmed that it was still possible to accept the out-of-court settlement. Mr. Harrison, I want to accept the proposal for $1.5 million. Are you sure, Richard? It's much less than you could win. I'm sure. My family helped me realize that sometimes the safe choice is worth more than the dream. Very well. I'll contact the other heirs and finalize the documents. In 2 weeks, everything will be resolved. Richard returned home and shared the decision with Margaret and Susan. I'm going to accept the settlement. In 2 weeks, we'll receive $1.5 million. Susan hugged her husband with tears in her eyes. I'm proud of you for making the most sensible decision. Margaret was also moved. Richard, I apologize for having doubted you. Now I understand that you were only trying to protect the family. Actually, Richard, I need to thank you. If it hadn't been for your insistence on finding out the truth, I might have kept suffering alone with this difficult decision. During the following 2 weeks, the family atmosphere was completely different. Richard went back to being the affectionate son-in-law and attentive husband he had always been. Margaret felt grateful for having insisted on finding out the truth, even when everyone thought she was being intrusive. The children noticed the positive change in the family environment, although they still didn't know about the inheritance. 1 week before the settlement was finalized, Richard received an unexpected phone call that would change everything again. Richard, this is Mr. Harrison. I have important news. What news, Mr. Harrison? The other heirs have just dropped their challenge. They found documents proving that your uncle was of sound mind when he wrote the will. Richard could hardly believe what he was hearing. Does that mean? This means you'll inherit the full $5 million, with no need for a settlement. Mr. Harrison, but I already accepted the $1.5 million settlement. Since it hasn't been signed yet, you can back out if you want. The choice is yours. Richard ended the call with his hands shaking. He rushed to tell Margaret and Susan the news. I can't believe it. The other heirs gave up. I can receive the $5 million with no risk. Susan was stunned. Richard, that's incredible. But now a new issue arises, said Margaret, always level-headed. You already gave your word on the settlement. Is it ethical to back out? Richard grew thoughtful. I have the legal right to cancel the settlement, since it hasn't been signed yet. But morally, Richard, you made the most sensible decision with the information you had at the time, said Susan. Now that the situation has changed, You have the right to reconsider. But what if it's a trap? What if the other heirs are giving up because they know something we don't? Margaret reflected for a few moments. Richard, call your lawyer and ask if he's absolutely certain there are no hidden catches. Richard immediately called Mr. Harrison. Sir, are you sure there are no risks? Isn't it strange that the other heirs gave up so suddenly? Richard, I personally examined the documents they found. They're medical and psychiatric records of your uncle, proving his soundness of mind until just days before his death. The other heirs know they no longer have a chance of winning. And there are no other legal complications? None. All taxes and fees have already been calculated. You would receive approximately $4,200,000 net. Richard ended the call and turned to his family. $4,200,000 net. What do you all think? Margaret and Susan exchanged glances. Richard, the decision is yours, said Susan. But if there are no risks, it would be foolish to turn it down. Margaret, what do you think? I think God is rewarding your honesty and our unity as a family. Accept the $5 million. Richard smiled for the first time in months with genuine happiness. Then it's decided. I'll cancel the settlement and receive the full inheritance. The next day, Richard went to Mr. Harrison's office to officially cancel the out-of-court settlement. Richard, before you cancel, I need to tell you something important, said the lawyer. What is it, sir? I found out who made the anonymous call to your mother-in-law. Richard was surprised. He had completely forgotten about that matter. Who was it? It was Mrs. Gladys, your neighbor. She called me yesterday to apologize. Gladys? Why would she do that? She said she saw strange movements at your house and unfamiliar cars. Since she's very fond of your family, she wanted to warn Margaret to stay alert. She didn't know they were legitimate legal matters. Richard laughed at the situation. So it was a misunderstanding from the start? Exactly. Mrs. Gladys was trying to protect you all, but she ended up causing unnecessary worry. Mr. Harrison, please pass along my thanks to her. In the end, Margaret's concern helped me make more sensible decisions. 2 days later, all the documents were signed, and the inheritance was officially transferred to Richard. When he arrived home with the papers confirming the deposit of $4,200,000, the whole family celebrated. Susan, Margaret, kids, come sit here. I have an important announcement to make, said Richard, gathering the whole family in the living room. Dad, what is it? Asked Tyler, the eldest son, aged 12. Kids, do you remember Great-Uncle George, my father's brother, who passed away a few months ago? I remember. You said you barely had any contact with him, replied Madison, the 9-year-old daughter. Exactly, but I found out he left me a very generous inheritance in his will. How much? Asked Tyler, curiously. Richard looked at Susan and Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. More than $4 million. The children were stunned. Tyler was the first to speak. Dad, does that mean we're rich? It means our family now has financial security for the rest of our lives. Madison jumped onto her father's lap. Are we going to buy a bigger house? Can I have a room of my own? We'll plan everything carefully, but yes, we're going to improve our quality of life. Margaret approached Richard. Richard, can I ask a question that has intrigued me this whole time? Of course, Margaret. Why didn't you tell us about the inheritance from the start? Even if there were risks, we could have faced them together. Richard sighed. Margaret, I grew up in a family where money problems always caused fights and separations. My biggest concern was protecting you from that anxiety, but I learned that family is for sharing not only joys but also worries. And you learned that because I went snooping through your papers, said Margaret, laughing. You learned that because you never gave up protecting your daughter and your grandchildren, even when everyone thought you were being intrusive. Susan hugged her mother. Mom, I apologize for doubting your intentions. You have always been and always will be the best mother in the world. Sweetheart, I also apologize for invading your privacy, but I don't regret insisting on finding out the truth. Richard turned to Margaret. Margaret, I want to make you a proposal. What proposal? How about we use part of this money to build a house where you have your own space but always close to us? Richard, you don't have to. Yes, I do. You are an essential part of this family, and I want you to feel valued and respected. That night, The whole family gathered in the backyard where Margaret had slept in the tent just a few weeks earlier. The space was now lit up and decorated for a small family celebration. Mrs. Gladys was invited to join them and to apologize in person for the confusion she had caused. "Margaret, dear, I'm so sorry for all the misunderstanding. I only wanted to protect you all." "Gladys, you don't need to apologize. Your concern was essential in helping us get to the truth. Thank you for caring for us like family." Richard stood up to make a toast. "I want to toast to the most important family in my life. To Margaret, who never gave up protecting us. To Susan, who supported me even without understanding everything. To the kids, who are our greatest treasure. And to our neighbor Gladys, who showed us the value of a community that cares." Everyone raised their glasses of juice and toasted together. "Dad, what are we going to do with all this money?" asked Tyler. "First, we're going to pay off all our debts. Then, we're going to buy a new house where Grandma has her own space. We'll invest in your education and set aside some for the future. And we're going to travel," added Madison excitedly. "Yes, we're going to travel. But the most important thing is that we're going to remain a close-knit family that shares joys and faces problems together." Margaret looked around the table and saw all the faces she loved lit up with genuine happiness. She remembered the cold nights in the tent, the feeling of rejection and loneliness, the fear of losing her family. But she also remembered what had motivated her throughout that difficult time. The unconditional love for her daughter and grandchildren, the determination to protect them even when she wasn't understood, the courage to insist on the truth even when criticized. "Richard, may I ask one more question?" said Margaret. "Of course." "During all this time, did you really think I was being intrusive out of ill will?" Richard reflected for a few moments before answering. "Margaret, deep down, I knew your intentions were good, but I was so pressured, so nervous about the whole situation, that I ended up interpreting your concern as distrust. And why didn't you try to explain it to me from the start?" "Because I was afraid you would judge me. I thought you might believe I was being greedy by fighting for $1 million inheritance. Richard, I would never think that. On the contrary, I would be proud to know you were fighting to improve our family's life." "I learned that transparency is always the best path in a family." Susan interrupted the conversation. "Hey everyone, I want to make an announcement too." They all looked at her curiously. "Mom, from today on you'll never have to worry about whether you're welcome in this family. Your place is here, with us, forever." Margaret felt emotional tears streaming down her face. "Sweetheart, those were the hardest days of my life, but they also showed me how strong our family is." "Why were they the hardest?" asked Madison. "Because Grandma thought she had lost you. The worst thing that can happen to a person is to feel rejected by the ones they love." "But you didn't lose us, Grandma. We just went through a rough patch," said Tyler. "Exactly, sweetheart. And I learned that true love always finds a way to solve problems." The party went on late into the night. The children fell asleep on the couch and the adults kept talking about plans for the future. "Richard, may I suggest something about how to use the money?" said Margaret. "Of course. Your suggestions will always be welcome. How about we set up a savings account for each child, to make sure they have opportunities to study and achieve their dreams?" "Excellent idea, Margaret. And we could also help Gladys with some renovations on her house. She's always been so kind to us." "I completely agree," said Susan. "And you, Margaret?" asked Richard. "What would you like for yourself?" "For me, I've already received the greatest gift possible, the certainty that my family loves and values me. Everything else is just a bonus." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. 3 months later, the family was already settled in the new house. It was a spacious property in a quiet neighborhood, with an independent annex for Margaret, but connected to the main house. Margaret had decorated her space with great care, creating a cozy atmosphere that reflected her personality. She had her own living room, bedroom, bathroom, and a small kitchen, but she always had meals together with the family. The backyard of the new house had become everyone's favorite spot for family conversations. That's where they gathered on Sunday afternoons to catch up and plan the week. On one of those Sunday afternoons, Margaret was playing with her grandchildren when she received an unexpected visit. It was a young woman, around 30 years old, who said she was a journalist writing a piece about families that overcame crises. "Mrs. Margaret, I heard about your story through Mr. Harrison, your son-in-law's lawyer. He mentioned it was an interesting case of how misunderstandings can almost destroy a family, but also how true love always wins in the end." Margaret was surprised by the journalist's interest. "I don't know if our story is all that interesting. Mrs. Margaret, your story shows that sometimes the people we love misinterpret our good intentions, but it also shows that persisting in love and truth always pays off." "That's true. There were moments when I thought I had lost my family forever. But you never gave up on protecting them." "Never. A mother doesn't give up on her children. A grandmother doesn't give up on her grandchildren, even when everyone thinks she's wrong." The journalist also talked with Susan and Richard, gathering different perspectives on the events. "Richard, did you ever regret keeping the inheritance a secret?" "Very much. I learned that family is for sharing not only achievements, but also concerns and fears." "And you, Susan, how do you feel about having doubted your mother's intentions?" "I feel ashamed. My mother devoted her entire life to protecting me, and at the first sign of difficulty, I chose to doubt her instead of trying to understand her concerns. But the important thing is that everyone learned from the experience." "Exactly. Our family is more united than ever." The article was published a few weeks later in a widely circulated magazine under the title, "Love Never Gives Up: How a Mother-in-Law Saved Her Family." Margaret was deeply moved to see her story shared with so many people. "Mom, you've become a celebrity," Susan teased. "Sweetheart, if our story can help other families understand one another better, then going through all those difficulties was worth it." A few weeks after the article was published, Margaret began receiving letters from women of all ages, but especially from grandmothers and mothers-in-law who identified with her experience. One of the letters that touched her the most was from a 70-year-old woman from the countryside of Chicago. "Mrs. Margaret, I read your story in the magazine and cried a lot. I went through a similar situation with my son-in-law. He was hiding financial problems from the family, and when I tried to help, I was seen as meddlesome. I went months without speaking to my daughter. Your story gave me the courage to try to reconcile with them. Thank you for showing that a mother's love never gives up." Margaret was so moved by these letters that she decided to personally reply to each one of them. Soon she was maintaining regular correspondence with dozens of women in complicated family situations. Richard suggested she create a support group in the community for older women facing family difficulties. "Margaret, you have a natural gift for advising and comforting people. Why not use that experience to help other families?" The idea began to grow, and within a few months Margaret had organized weekly meetings at the local church. The group started with 5 women and quickly grew to over 20. The meetings always began with Margaret sharing her own experience, followed by testimonies from other participants. Then they discussed strategies for handling family conflicts in a loving yet firm way. One of the regular participants was a woman named Martha, who was having trouble with her daughter-in-law. "Mrs. Margaret, my daughter-in-law won't let me see my grandchildren. She says I'm too critical and that I interfere in the children's upbringing." "Martha, do you actually interfere in your grandchildren's upbringing?" "Sometimes I offer my opinion when I think she's doing something wrong." "And how do you offer those opinions?" Martha reflected. "Well, usually in front of the children, so they know they have other options." Margaret shook her head with understanding. "Martha, I know your intentions are good, but giving opinions in front of the children undermines the parents' authority. But what if they're actually doing something harmful? In that case, you speak privately with your son or daughter-in-law. You explain your concerns with love, not criticism. And what if they won't listen? Then you need to accept that they are the parents, and their decisions must be respected, even when we disagree." These conversations helped Margaret reflect on her own experience and realize that she had learned valuable lessons about the line between protection and interference. In one of the meetings, a new participant named Beverly shared a situation that struck everyone. "My daughters want to put me in a nursing home because they think I can't take care of myself anymore." "Do you think they're right?" Margaret asked gently. I don't know anymore. Sometimes I forget things. I leave the stove on. I get lost at the grocery store. But I don't want to leave my house. Beverly, what kind of help do you need to stay at home? Someone to help me with the shopping. Remind me to take my medicine and stay with me a little during the day. Margaret had an idea. How about we talk to your daughters about hiring a caregiver to help you at home? It could be cheaper than a nursing home and would let you keep your independence. You think they would go for it? There's only one way to find out. Do you want me to talk to them? Margaret began to become more and more deeply involved in the lives of the people who attended the group. She discovered she had a natural gift for mediating family conflicts and finding solutions that worked for everyone involved. Richard and Susan were proud to see Margaret finding a new purpose in life. "Mum, you're doing a wonderful job with those women," Susan said. "Sweetheart, I've discovered that my difficult experiences can be useful for helping other people. It's as if all the suffering I went through now has a greater meaning." "What do you mean? If I hadn't gone through the experience of almost losing you, I wouldn't understand so well the despair these other mothers and grandmothers feel. My pain gave me the wisdom to comfort them." A year after the support group started, Margaret was invited to give a talk at a conference on intergenerational family relationships. The topic of the talk was love that protects versus love that suffocates, finding the balance in the modern family. Margaret was nervous. She had never spoken to such a large audience, but when she stepped onto the stage and saw hundreds of people interested in her experience, she felt inspired. 2 years ago, I slept in a tent in the backyard of my own house because my family thought I was being intrusive and paranoid. Today I'm here to share with you what I learned about the difference between loving by protecting and loving by controlling. The talk was a success. Margaret received dozens of invitations to speak at other conferences, churches, and community groups. Richard was impressed by Margaret's transformation. "Margaret, you've become a community leader. Who would have thought those hard days in the tent would lead to this?" "Richard, I believe God uses our most painful experiences to prepare us to help others going through similar situations." "And how does it feel to be recognized as an expert on family relationships?" "Funny. I don't consider myself an expert, just a woman who made mistakes, learned from them, and wants to help other people avoid the same suffering." Margaret's house became an informal counseling center. She regularly received visits from people who had heard her talks and wanted to talk about their own family situations. One of those visits was particularly memorable. He was a man around 40 years old, accompanied by his elderly mother. "Mrs. Margaret, my mother is doing the same thing you did to your son-in-law. She keeps going through my things, questioning my decisions, and my wife can't take it anymore." Margaret looked at the young man's mother and saw in her eyes the same anguish she herself had felt. "What's your name, dear?" Margaret asked the woman. "Francis." "Mrs. Margaret, I'm not being nosy out of malice. It's just that I've seen strange things and I'm worried." Margaret immediately recognized the situation. "Francis, tell me what strange things you've seen." "My son has been receiving phone calls that make him nervous. He's been going out at odd hours, and I found papers I don't understand in his room." The son interrupted. "Mom, I already explained that it's work-related." "What's your name, son?" Margaret asked. "Charles." "Charles, can I suggest something? Instead of getting angry at your mother for worrying, how about explaining to her exactly what's going on?" "Mrs. Margaret, it's confidential work-related matters." "I understand. But your mother doesn't need to know the details. She just needs to be sure that you're not in any dangerous trouble." Margaret turned to Francis. "Francis, what's your greatest fear?" "I'm afraid my son is involved in something that could harm him or the family." "And you, Charles, why don't you want to tell your mother about these work matters?" "Because they're complicated things she wouldn't understand, and they might not work out." Margaret smiled. "Charles, your story reminds me a lot of my own family. Richard was also dealing with complex legal matters and didn't want to worry us. And how did you resolve it?" "He told the whole truth, even though it was complicated, and we discovered that facing problems as a family is much better than facing them alone." Margaret spoke separately with mother and son, helping each one understand the other's point of view. By the end of the conversation, Charles decided to explain to his mother that he was negotiating a job change that could involve a transfer to another city, and that was why he was receiving calls and handling confidential documents. "Mom, I didn't tell you because I'm still not sure it will work out, and I didn't want to worry the family. Son, if there's a possibility of a move, we want to help you make the best decision." "You're right, Mom. I'll tell you everything at home." After they left, Margaret reflected on how she had become a sort of natural mediator for family conflicts. That evening, during dinner, she shared her thoughts with Richard and Susan. "Have you noticed how our experience has helped other families?" "I have, Mom. You have a special gift for making people understand each other." "It's not a gift, sweetheart. It's experience. Someone who has been through a storm knows better how to guide others who are facing similar storms." Richard nodded. "Richard, Margaret, you turned your pain into purpose. It's inspiring to see how you grew from that difficult experience." "Richard, can I confess something?" "Of course. Today I'm grateful for having gone through those days in the tent." Susan and Richard were surprised. "Grateful, Mom? Why?" "Because it was there, alone and rejected, that I learned lessons I never would have learned any other way. I learned that true love persists even when it isn't understood. I learned that the truth always comes to light, even if it takes time. And I learned that our most painful experiences can become our greatest sources of wisdom." Richard was moved. "Margaret, I apologize again for having allowed it to reach that point." "Richard, don't apologize. If it hadn't reached that point, I wouldn't have discovered my inner strength, my ability to persevere in love, and my ability to help other people." "That's a beautiful perspective, Mom." "Sweetheart, I believe everything in life has a purpose. Sometimes we go through difficulties, not just for our own growth, but to prepare ourselves to help others who will go through similar situations." 2 years after those events, Margaret had become a well-known figure in the community. Her support group had grown into a formal organization, with regular meetings at several churches and community centers around the city. She had also written a short autobiographical book telling her story, titled "When Love Feels Like an Invasion: Memoirs of a Mother-in-Law Who Never Gave Up." The book became popular among older women and families who were facing intergenerational conflicts. On a Sunday afternoon, Margaret was organizing her papers when she found a photo of the old tent in the backyard of their previous home. It was a picture Gladys had taken during those difficult days. She called Susan over to see the photo. "Sweetheart, do you remember those days?" "I do, Mom. And every time I see this photo, I get emotional thinking about everything you went through. And I get emotional thinking about everything I gained from this experience." "What do you mean?" "Susan, before that crisis, I was just an ordinary mother-in-law and grandmother. Today, I'm a woman who knows her worth, who trusts her instincts, and who uses her experiences to help other people." "You always had worth, Mom." "I did, but I didn't know it. I had to almost lose you all to discover my own strength." At that moment, Richard arrived home with some special news. "Margaret, Susan, come see." They hurried to the living room, where Richard was holding a local newspaper. "What is it?" asked Susan. "Margaret was chosen as Woman of the Year by the city's Community Association." Margaret was stunned. "What do you mean?" "The article says your work with families in crisis has been transforming the community. You'll receive the award at a ceremony next month." Margaret sat down on the couch, still in shock. "I can't believe it. Me, who 2 years ago was being seen as a meddling mother-in-law, now I'm receiving an award for helping families." "Mum, this shows that when we act with genuine love, even if we're misunderstood at first, the truth always prevails," said Susan. "And it shows that our hardest experiences can become our greatest achievements," added Richard. At the award ceremony, Margaret was invited to give an acceptance speech. She walked onto the stage nervously, but when she saw the audience full of people she had helped over the past 2 years, she felt confident. 3 years ago, I spent the loneliest nights of my life sleeping in a tent in the backyard of my own home, rejected by the very family I had raised with so much love. Today, I stand here receiving this award from the hands of that same family who loves and values me." The audience applauded emotionally. "This award isn't mine. It belongs to all the mothers, mothers-in-law, and grandmothers who never give up protecting the ones they love, even when they're misunderstood. It belongs to all the families who have the courage to face their conflicts with honesty and love. I want to dedicate this award especially to my son-in-law Richard, who taught me that sometimes we hide truths out of love, but that transparency is always the best path. To my daughter Susan, who taught me that forgiveness can heal any wound, and to my grandchildren, who taught me that true love always finds a way to express itself. But most of all, I want to dedicate this award to all the women who are going through difficult times in their families. Don't give up. Persistent love always wins, the truth always comes to light, and our most painful experiences can become our greatest sources of wisdom and purpose. The audience rose in an emotional standing ovation. Margaret stepped down from the stage and was embraced by Susan, Richard, and the grandchildren. "Grandma, we're so proud of you," said Tyler, now 15 years old. "Grandma is famous," added Madison, age 12. "I'm not famous, my darlings. I'm just a grandmother who learned that love never gives up even when everything seems lost." That night, the family gathered in the backyard of the new house for an intimate celebration. Margaret looked around the table and saw all the faces she loved illuminated by happiness and pride. "Richard, may I ask a question I've always wanted to ask?" "Of course, Margaret. If you could go back in time, would you change anything about the way you handled the inheritance?" Richard reflected for a few moments. "I would change the excessive secrecy. I would have told you from the beginning, even if it meant sharing the worries. But I wouldn't change the final outcome, because everything led us to be here today, united and stronger. And you, sweetheart, would you change anything?" "I would change my initial reaction. I should have trusted you more from the start, but I also wouldn't change the outcome, because it made me realize how much I love and value you." Margaret smiled. "Then I wouldn't change anything either, because I discovered that sometimes we almost need to lose something to understand its true value." "What else did you learn from this whole experience, Mother?" "I learned that true love is never invasive when it comes from a pure heart. I learned that persisting in the truth, even when misunderstood, always pays off. And I learned that our greatest difficulties can become our greatest victories." "Grandma, tell us what it was like sleeping in the tent," Madison asked. "It was cold, lonely, and frightening. But it was also where I learned that I am stronger than I ever imagined, that my love for you is unbreakable, and that I can face any storm if it means protecting my family. Weren't you angry with us?" "No, sweetheart. I was sad but never angry. I knew you were acting based on the information you had, and that if you were wrong, the truth would eventually come to light." Richard stood up to make another toast. "I want to toast to Margaret, the bravest woman I know, who turned rejection into determination, pain into purpose, and near loss into complete victory." Everyone raised their glasses. "To Margaret," they said in chorus. "No, my dear ones, to all the mothers, mothers-in-law, and grandmothers who never give up protecting those they love. To all the families who have the courage to face their differences with love and honesty. To all who believe that true love always finds a way." That night, Margaret went to sleep in her comfortable, cozy bedroom, looking out the window at the backyard where she had spent those difficult nights in the tent. She felt no bitterness or resentment. She felt gratitude. Gratitude for having a family that loved her, for having discovered her own strength, and for having found a greater purpose for her life. Before falling asleep, she said a silent prayer. "Thank you, God, for not answering my prayers during those days in the tent, when I asked for everything to go back to normal quickly. Thank you for allowing the situation to last long enough for all of us to learn valuable lessons. Thank you for transforming my pain into purpose, my rejection into fulfillment, and my near failure into complete victory." And so, Margaret Miller, the mother-in-law who was kicked out of her home and had to sleep in the backyard, became the woman who helped hundreds of families reunite through persistent love and truth. The reason for her expulsion, loving concern disguised as intrusion, proved to be her greatest asset, the ability to see beyond appearances and never give up protecting those she loves. Her story spread beyond the city, inspiring women across the country to never give up on their families, even when misunderstood. And when people asked Margaret what the secret was to turning a family crisis into a complete victory, she always answered with a smile. True love never gives up. It may be misunderstood, rejected, questioned, but if it is genuine, it always finds a way to prevail. And when it prevails, it transforms not only those who receive it, but especially those who offer it. End of the story. Now tell me, what did you think of Margaret's story? Do you believe she made the right decisions when she investigated Richard? How would you react in a similar situation? Share your opinions in the comments. If this story touched you in any way, leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other emotional stories like this one.